The first time I hauled something from the waters of the Mariana Trench, I knew it wasn't meant for human hands. Its body writhed in the net like a knot of muscle and bone, too warm for something pulled from a mile below. That was when the old captain reminded me that there were 11 rules we had to follow if we wanted to make it back alive. I thought they were just superstitions until I broke one and the ocean answered back. I can still hear it now, clawing at the hull, waiting for me to slip again. The old captain's voice was rough with salt and smoke when he first told me Rule 1. Never pull in a catch after midnight. At the time I thought it was nothing more than a tired superstition, one of those sayings older men cling to when they've been out at sea too long. But when I stood at the railing that first night, staring down into the dark swells of the Mariana Trench, I understood why he said it. The sea after midnight feels different, like the water is alive in a way that has nothing to do with tides or current. It waits, patient and breathing, and you start to feel as if it wants you to make a mistake. I remember that night vividly, because it was my first time on a deep-sea rig that close to the trench. The vessel itself was built like a floating fortress, every beam groaning against the endless pull of the deep, every light a desperate attempt to push back the darkness. The captain and crew worked like clockwork, hauling lines, checking nets, logging the catches, but when the clocks turned past 12, everything changed. Nets were pulled in early, winches locked, and no one dared drop another line. At first I thought it was a matter of safety, some regulation about exhaustion or equipment failure. I didn't yet know it was about survival. I leaned against the railing, restless, with the storm lanterns humming behind me. The water gleamed like black glass, perfectly still, and that silence made me uneasy. My mind told me that fish didn't care about clocks, that the trench was teeming with life no matter the hour. Yet the deck behind me was deserted, the crew retreating to their bunks, leaving me with nothing but the steady creak of steel and the pulse of my own blood in my ears. It was in that silence I first felt the pressure, not physical, but like a hand pressing on my chest, daring me to break the rule I had just been told. Temptation in the deep comes quietly, a faint tug at a line, a shimmer of light too far below, a shape moving just under the surface. That night, I swear I saw something flicker beneath the waves, faint and pale like a lantern swaying underwater. My hands itched to lower a net, to prove the superstition wrong, to haul up something no one else had dared to touch. The rational part of me said it was nothing but moonlight playing tricks, but another part whispered that it was calling me, offering me a prize too rare to ignore. The crew had trusted me with a rule, yet my pride wanted to test it. The first sound came from the water itself, not splashing, not crashing, but something deeper, a resonance that traveled through the hull into my bones. It was like standing next to a cathedral organ when it struck a low note, too vast and heavy for ears alone. I froze at the railing, my knuckles whitening, because I realized the sound wasn't echoing upward, it was answering something. The trench was speaking, and I was foolish enough to be listening. I glanced behind me, but the deck was empty, and the captain's door remained shut. If I wanted to, I could throw a line in and no one would know until morning. Instead, I gripped the railing tighter, my heart beat loud in the silence. That pale glow beneath the surface had shifted, moving closer, swaying with a rhythm far too steady to be a current. It was almost gentle, like a lantern bobbing in the hands of someone waiting below. Every instinct screamed that it wasn't natural, but curiosity is its own kind of hunger. I thought of how it would feel to pull something miraculous from the dark, to be the first to see it, to prove that not all rules were carved in truth. The sea was daring me, and I almost gave in. I don't know what held me back, but as I reached for the winch, the glow stopped. It hovered for a moment, and then, slowly, it began to rise. The water around it shimmered, faint ripples spreading outward, and for a heartbeat, I thought I had imagined it. Then I saw fingers, long, pale, reaching fingers breaking the surface without a splash, curling around the edge of the net that had been left hanging loose. My chest locked tight, and I stumbled backward, realizing that whatever it was had been waiting for me to offer a way up. The light hadn't been moonlight at all. it had been bait. The hand gripped the rope with startling strength, and I could hear the fibers strain. The glow beneath pulsed brighter, not like a lantern now, but like a heartbeat, steady and alive. I backed toward the captain's door, torn between calling out and staying silent, afraid that if I made a sound it would look at me. The rope creaked again, and I saw the shape begin to pull itself higher. Not a fish, not any creature I had studied in books, but something that had the deliberate patience of a person climbing. My chest burned with the need to run, but my legs refused to move. The captain's door swung open, and his eyes met mine before darting to the rope. He didn't hesitate. His boots hammered the deck as he rushed past me, his hand seizing the axe kept near the railing. Without a word, he swung it down onto the rope, severing it with one blow. The net plunged back into the water, dragging the pale hand with it, and the glow vanished into the depths like a dying star. Silence swallowed the deck again, broken only by the captain's ragged breathing as he turned to me. His eyes weren't angry, they were filled with something colder, fear. He didn't shout, he didn't need to. He just leaned close and said, "You were about to break the only thing keeping you alive." His voice was sharp enough to cut through my haze, and suddenly I felt the weight of what I had almost done. The rules weren't folklore, they were boundaries, thin walls against something that waited for us in the dark. I wanted to apologize, to explain that I hadn't meant to, but he shook his head. "Not tonight," he said, before walking back into his cabin and leaving me trembling in the shadows of the deck. Sleep didn't come easily after that. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw that hand, pale and eager, curling around the rope as if it had been waiting for my mistake. I wondered how many before me had pulled in their nets after midnight, thinking they were safe, thinking the ocean was just water and fish. The silence of the crew the next morning told me the answer. They all knew what I had nearly done, and they didn't look at me as one of their own anymore. I had almost invited something aboard, and that stain lingers. That was only the first night, only the first lesson. There were still 10 more rules to follow, and I already felt the trench testing me, waiting for me to falter again. The captain had saved me once, but I knew he wouldn't always be there. The ocean wanted me, and it had all the time in the world. The captain didn't need to tell me twice about Rule 2. Never answer a voice that calls your name from the water. I had already seen enough the night before to know these rules weren't just old sailors' tales. Still, when dawn broke and the crew went about their work, I couldn't shake the feeling that something unseen lingered just below the waves, watching, waiting. I kept hearing faint impressions, like whispers carried on the wind, though no one else seemed to notice. Maybe I was rattled, or maybe I was already marked. Either way, the second rule pressed against my thoughts before I even knew why. The day dragged on with heavy nets and quiet glances. No one spoke about what had happened the night before, but the way they avoided my eyes told me they all knew I had nearly broken the first rule. The silence weighed on me, and I busied myself checking lines, cleaning gear, anything to keep my hands occupied. By the time night returned, the sea looked even darker than before, its surface like polished stone reflecting the dim lantern light. The captain ordered the nets reeled in earlier than usual, and the crew obeyed without complaint, leaving me alone again with the trench's endless breath beneath us. That was when I first heard it clearly. My name, not a whisper, not a trick of the wind, but spoken as if someone stood just below the deck, calling up to me. It was my mother's voice, soft and familiar, the way she used to call me in from the yard as a boy. My blood turned cold. She had been gone for years, buried in a churchyard far from any coast. I gripped the railing tight, staring at the waves, and told myself it was my imagination. Yet the sound came again, louder, laced with patience, like whoever spoke knew I would eventually answer. I tried to distract myself by focusing on the lanterns, the creak of the rig, the faint hum of machinery, but the voice cut through everything else. It wasn't constant. It came in intervals, as though waiting for me to respond before repeating. The third time, I heard it closer, as if the speaker was rising from below, and it carried not only my name, but also a note of affection, the exact tone my mother used when she wanted me to come inside quickly. My heart pounded, torn between instinct and dread. Every fiber of me wanted to call back, to ask how it was possible, to reach for the impossible comfort of a dead woman's voice. Instead, I stepped back from the railing, forcing myself to breathe. The captain's warning rang in my skull like a bell. Never answer. That was the second rule, and I clung to it as if it were a rope in a storm. But I realized then how dangerous it truly was, because the voice didn't sound monstrous or threatening. It sounded kind. It sounded familiar. That was the trap. I pressed my palms against my ears, but the sound was inside me, vibrating through my bones. And then I heard another voice, this one belonging to my brother, speaking my name with the same pleading urgency he had used the day before he drowned. I stumbled backward until I reached the cabin door, but the voices followed. They multiplied, weaving together in a chorus of every loved one I had ever lost. The trench had a memory, and it was reaching into mine, pulling out the softest, most painful pieces to use against me. My throat tightened with the urge to shout, to demand they stop, but I bit down on the inside of my cheek until I tasted blood. If I gave in, even for a moment, I didn't know what would come out of that water to claim me. The deck suddenly groaned under a weight that hadn't been there before. The air grew colder, and I smelled brine stronger than ever, as though the sea itself had climbed aboard. I turned slowly, and for a moment, I swore I saw a figure standing at the far end of the deck. It was my mother, or something shaped like her hair dripping, her eyes wide with an invitation that froze me in place. She lifted her hand and beckoned, the faintest smile pulling at her lips, while the voices around me swelled until they shook my skull. My knees nearly buckled, and I gripped the wall to keep myself upright. The captain's door burst open again, and his lantern cut through the darkness. The figure dissolved like smoke, and the voices shriveled into silence as if burned away by the light. The captain glared at me, his jaw clenched, and I realized he had been waiting for this. "You hear them now," he said quietly. Not a question, but a grim confirmation. He didn't ask if I had answered, because the fact that I was still standing there proved I hadn't. Still, the way his eyes searched mine made me feel as if he were measuring how much of me the trench had already taken. I followed him inside, too shaken to speak. The crew avoided me again at breakfast, and this time I knew why. They had all heard the calls at some point, and they knew how close I had come to breaking the rule. My hands shook when I reached for food, and I left the table without eating. The silence of the men was worse than the voices. It told me this wasn't a one-time test. The trench would keep calling, night after night, until it found me weak enough to answer. That evening, I stood by the porthole instead of the deck, determined to keep distance between myself and the water. But when the hour grew late, the voice came again, softer this time, almost tender, slipping through the glass, as though it were nothing but mist. I pressed my forehead to the metal frame and whispered to myself that I wouldn't respond, that no matter what it said or who it pretended to be, I wouldn't let the trench win. The silence after each call felt heavier, like it was waiting just outside the window, patient, eternal. I didn't sleep that night. Every time I closed my eyes, I heard the faint sound of breathing just beyond the walls of the vessel, as though something was pressed against it, ear to the steel, listening for me to speak. I realized then why the rule was so important, not because the voice alone could harm me, but because the moment I answered, I would no longer belong to myself. The trench would have me, and it would drag me into its dark, endless heart. By dawn, my throat was raw from holding back words that wanted to escape. I don't know if I spoke them aloud or just mouthed them in my dreams, but the pull was undeniable. I had survived one more night, but only barely, and as I stumbled onto the deck with hollow eyes, I saw the next rule carved into the logbook, a warning written in the captain's hand, waiting for the next lesson. The boat rocked harder than usual. The night I first learned Rule 3, never let the net surface if it feels heavier than it should. My arms strained against the rope, sweat mixing with salt spray, as the line groaned like something alive beneath the waves. At first, I thought it was just a big haul, maybe more tuna than we had seen in weeks, but the weight had a wrongness to it, like pulling up a building instead of fish. The others watched me, silent, as if waiting for me to notice what they already knew. I remembered Dario, the youngest on the crew, whispering that he could hear something below, something breathing in rhythm with my pulls. The idea chilled me more than the night air ever could. I froze, trying to steady the rope, and realized the line didn't sway like normal. It dragged against me, tugging down with a steady, patient pull. "Let it go," Jonas said softly from the wheel, his face pale under the lantern glow. "Don't be a fool, you'll bring it up." His words didn't feel like advice. They felt like a warning. My pride nearly killed me that night. I wanted to prove myself, to show I could handle the net, just like the old-timers, and the thought of a massive catch was too tempting to ignore. But as the rope burned against my palms, I realized the sound below wasn't water or fish. It was a slow, deliberate scraping, as if metal dragged against something vast and hidden. I dropped the rope in a panic, and the net slithered back into the trench, swallowed by the dark. The silence afterward was so heavy it pressed on my chest like another weight. Jonas said nothing for a long time, but the way he looked at me told me I'd passed some kind of test. Dario wouldn't meet my eyes, muttering prayers under his breath like he'd already seen my grave. I tried to laugh it off, saying maybe it was just a shark caught in the mesh, but even I didn't believe that. I couldn't shake the feeling that if I had pulled just once more, something would have broken the surface that wasn't meant to be seen. And worse, I think it wanted me to try. I couldn't sleep that night, the image of the rope burning through my hands replaying with every blink. I kept hearing faint echoes against the hull, as though something massive brushed against us from below, testing the wood, tracing our shape. Each time I thought it was my imagination, a thud would follow, not strong enough to alarm the others, but steady enough that I knew I wasn't alone in hearing it. I remembered Jonas's warning, and for the first time since boarding this boat, I wished I had never agreed to learn the rules. The next morning, Dario was gone. His bunk was empty, his boots still neatly at the side, laces tied. There was no sign of struggle, no splash in the night, nothing to explain it. The captain said he must have jumped, but that didn't make sense. Dario was terrified of the water. Jonas just shook his head and muttered that breaking rules didn't always mean immediate death. Sometimes it meant the sea waited until you forgot, until you thought you were safe again. Nobody argued with him. We just worked in silence, each of us stealing glances at the nets, waiting for them to betray us. That day I didn't dare touch the lines, even when the floats dipped hard like something big had taken the bait. I let the others handle it, though I noticed they too tugged with hesitation, ready to let go at any sign of unnatural weight. Every groan of the rope made my stomach twist, and I couldn't stop imagining what might have been rising from the trench the night before. I asked Jonas once what would happen if someone ignored the rule completely, if they forced the net all the way up, despite the heaviness. His eyes turned away, fixed on the horizon, and he answered with a single word: disappear. The word haunted me. Disappear. Not die, not drown, not get dragged overboard. Just disappear. I wondered if that's what happened to Dario, that maybe he hadn't jumped or been pulled, but simply ceased to exist, taken by whatever thing I had almost hauled onto the deck. I wanted to believe Jonas was exaggerating, that it was all just sailor's superstition, but the emptiness of Dario's bunk gnawed at me worse than any nightmare. Superstition doesn't steal a man without a trace. Something real had happened, and I was closer to it than I ever wanted to be. That night, I stayed awake in the galley, staring out the small porthole into the endless black. I swore I saw glimmers moving far below, lights like lanterns swaying in currents too deep for human eyes. Once I thought I saw a shape among them, vast and angular, gliding with impossible slowness. My heart hammered, and I backed away from the glass, afraid the thing might notice me watching. Later, when the others slept, I heard the sound again, the scraping, deliberate, patient, waiting sound. It wasn't at the nets this time. It was at the hull right beneath my feet. I thought about leaving the ship at the next port, pretending I'd never been here, never learned these rules. But even as I imagined stepping onto solid land, I felt a pull in my chest, a curiosity mixed with dread. I realized that whatever lived down there didn't just want to be left alone. It wanted to be acknowledged. It wanted us to try, to break the rules, to bring it closer. And though I'd dropped the rope in time, I couldn't help but wonder if it had already chosen me, marked me for trying to lift it from the deep. The next evening, as we sailed closer to the trench, the sea grew eerily calm, like a mirror stretching in all directions. Jonas wouldn't let us fish, not in water like that. He said the calm was a trick, a way for the trench to lure fools into testing their luck. I didn't argue. I sat with my back against the railing, gripping the deck hard, terrified the water might suddenly rise up for me. But even in my fear, I knew one thing for certain. I had only just begun to understand the rules, and breaking them wasn't just about death. It was about being claimed by something waiting in the dark. I learned too late why Jonas kept repeating Rule 4. Never step onto deck when the sea turns silent, as if it was the most important rule of all. At first, I didn't understand what silence meant. The ocean is never quiet, always filled with the rush of waves, the creak of boards, or the cries of gulls. But on the third night after Dario vanished, the world outside went utterly still, as though someone had pulled the plug on existence itself. No wind stirred, no water lapped against the hull. Even the lantern flame held perfectly still without a flicker. The silence pressed on my eardrums until it felt like my head might split open. I thought about ignoring Jonas's warning, just for a moment, because curiosity clawed at me worse than fear. The air inside the cabin was suffocating, every breath too loud, every heartbeat too sharp, and the door leading onto the deck seemed to pull at me. My hand hovered on the latch, as though some invisible thread wanted me to see what waited beyond it. But Jonas's voice from earlier rang in my skull, gravelly and urgent. You'll think you're safe when it's quiet. That's the lie. That's when it wants you most. The it he meant needed no explanation. I forced myself to step back, trembling, but not everyone on board was as disciplined. From the corner of my eye, I saw Matteo, one of the night watch, push open the door. His boots thudded softly on the planks, and then the sound stopped altogether, swallowed by the silence outside. I didn't want to follow, but fear of being alone pushed me after him, and I cracked the door just enough to peer through. Matteo stood frozen mid-step, staring at something far off the bow. His body shuddered like a man caught between waking and sleep. Then his head turned slowly, far too slowly, until his face locked with mine. His eyes were gone. The sockets weren't bloody or torn. They were just smooth and empty, as if skin had grown over where his gaze used to be. His mouth moved, forming words I couldn't hear, but the silence made it worse, like watching a nightmare on mute. I slammed the door shut and stumbled back, bile rising in my throat. The captain demanded to know what I'd seen, but I couldn't form the words. Jonas only muttered, "Too late for him now," before pouring himself a shot of something strong. That was the first time I realized the rules weren't written to keep us alive. They were written to tell us what kind of death we might avoid. Matteo's bunk was empty the next morning, but unlike Dario's disappearance, his boots were gone too, and his blanket folded neatly. It looked staged, like someone had tidied his things after he left, but none of us admitted to touching them. When I finally asked Jonas how many men we'd lost to that silence over the years, he only stared at the sea and said, "Enough to know it's not silence at all. It's listening." That word lodged in my brain like a hook. Listening. If the trench could listen, then every creak of our floorboards, every whispered fear in the dark, was being collected, stored waiting to be used. From then on, I dreaded the nights more than the storms. I'd press my pillow against my ears, but it never mattered. The silence always returned, unbroken, unnatural, crushing in its weight. Sometimes I swore I felt vibrations under my feet, as if something enormous shifted below us during those quiet hours. Once I saw the lantern glow dim slightly, not flickering, but fading as if a shadow passed between it and the world. I begged Jonas to tell me what happened. If you stayed on deck too long during the silence. He wouldn't answer. The only clue came when I noticed the roll call in the captain's book, name scratched out with no explanation. On the 7th night, the silence came again, thick and merciless. I gripped the edge of my bunk, praying no one would open the hatch this time. For a while it seemed like we'd made it. But then I heard the faint squeal of the hinges, and the soft tread of someone stepping outside. The air left my lungs, and I ran to stop them, but Jonas's hand shot out, iron strong, holding me back. "Don't," he whispered, his face inches from mine. "If you look too long it notices you. Let him go." I wanted to scream, to fight, but when I glanced toward the door, the silence deepened into something alive, pressing harder, waiting. I stayed put. The next day, another man was gone, and this time, his name wasn't written in the captain's book at all. It was as if he had never existed. No bunk, no belongings, nothing. The crew avoided speaking about it, but the unease sat heavy in the air. I couldn't shake the thought that the silence wasn't just stealing people, it was erasing them. My mind twisted with the fear that one day I might wake up to find no one remembered me either, that I'd been taken into that mute darkness with no trace. Jonas's warning echoed in my skull, and I clung to it like a lifeline. That evening, the captain called me into his quarters. He asked me directly if I understood the rules now, if I truly grasped why we followed them. I admitted I didn't, that all I had were fragments of fear and half-truths. He leaned closer, his breath heavy with rum. "You don't need to understand," he said. "You just need to obey. Because once the sea knows your name, there's no silence strong enough to keep it from calling you." His words sent a chill deeper than any spray of cold water ever had. I realized then that rules weren't just instructions. They were bargains. Fragile, temporary bargains with something vast and hungry. That night, I lay awake, bracing myself for the silence. When it came, it was worse than ever. Not only the stillness, but an emptiness in my mind, as if even my thoughts were being hushed. I clutched the edge of my mattress, desperate not to move, not to breathe too loud, terrified the sea would hear me. Then faintly, I thought I felt a breath against my ear, warm and patient, though I was alone in the dark. I shut my eyes tight, praying morning would come before I lost my nerve. But in that moment, I knew the rules weren't enough anymore. Something already had me marked. By the time I was told about Rule 5, never eat fish that wash themselves onto the deck, I already knew better than to laugh at the rules. Still, it sounded ridiculous at first. What kind of fish would willingly leap aboard a boat, practically begging to be caught? But the sea had its own ways, and as the days dragged on, I realized how little of it followed the logic of the surface. It was a foggy morning when I saw the first one, flopping at my boots without a net or hook in sight, its scales glistening faintly as though they reflected light from somewhere deeper than the sun could ever reach. The fish looked wrong, not in an obvious way, but in a way that set my teeth on edge. Its gills opened and closed too slowly, as if it didn't need to breathe. Its eyes weren't the cloudy glass of dying fish, but sharp, almost watchful, tracking every shift of my hand. I bent down, ready to scoop it up, but Jonas's boot slammed down near my fingers, startling me. "Don't touch it," he snapped, his voice low but firm. He grabbed a mop handle and shoved the thing back over the side, where it sank faster than it should have, disappearing into the wake without a ripple. The rest of the crew barely looked up, as if this was normal. I pressed Jonas for an answer, asking what harm one fish could possibly cause if cooked. He only shook his head. "It's not food, it's bait," he muttered, then walked away. The words stuck with me, echoing louder than his warning. Bait. But for what? That night, as we sat in the galley with our ration stew, I noticed everyone avoided speaking about the incident, but I caught the captain's eyes flick toward the deck door more than once. His silence said enough. He feared it too. The next morning, I awoke to find 3 fish laid neatly along the starboard side, arranged in a perfect row. Nobody claimed to have seen them jump, and the nets had been stowed all night. Their mouths hung open as if mid-laugh, and I swear I could hear a faint clicking noise, like teeth grinding together, though no one else seemed to notice. The cook was the one who broke. Tired of thin rations and suspicious of our fear, he declared he'd fry them up. "Food is food," he scoffed, scooping them into a bucket before anyone could stop him. Jonas turned pale, but the captain didn't intervene. Maybe he knew it was already too late. At dinner, the smell was almost too good, richer than any fish I'd ever known. It filled the galley like incense, drawing us in against our better judgment. The cook served himself first, tearing into the flesh with a grin. I forced myself to look away, but I caught glimpses. The meat was too white, too perfect, steaming without oil, as though it cooked itself. The cook devoured it greedily, smacking his lips, insisting it was the best he'd ever tasted. But within minutes, his grin faltered, his eyes clouded, and his hand began trembling. He dropped the fork and clutched his throat, though he wasn't choking. He whispered something I'll never forget. "They're still moving inside me." We rushed to him, but his body convulsed before we could act. His stomach swelled unnaturally, his veins darkened to a bluish black, and he collapsed, gasping like a fish out of water. For a moment, the galley was chaos, men shouting, someone praying, but then the cook grew still, too still. His chest no longer rose, yet his eyes darted back and forth beneath closed lids, as if he were dreaming with violent intensity. Jonas pulled us away, shouting for everyone to leave him, but I hesitated at the door. Just before I stepped out, I saw the cook's mouth open slightly, and from within, a faint bubbling sound echoed. Not breath, not words, something else. By dawn, the cook was gone. His bunk was empty, the sheets neatly folded, no trace of struggle, only a faint wetness on the pillow remained, soaking through the cloth as if seawater had seeped in from nowhere. No one spoke of him again. His name was never logged in the captain's records after that night, just like Mateo before him. It was as though the sea had claimed him completely, leaving behind only a whisper of who he'd been. The rest of us eyed the deck warily, half expecting more fish to appear, half praying they wouldn't. The silence of the crew was thicker than fog. 2 days later, the bait returned. This time, 5 of them, all lined in a crooked pattern near the bow. I stared too long, drawn by the unnatural shimmer of their scales, until Jonas smacked me across the back of the head. "Don't look at them," he hissed. His voice shook, which scared me more than his slap. The captain ordered us to toss them overboard without a word, and we obeyed. But as the last one slid into the sea, I caught sight of something beneath the waves, long pale limbs brushing just under the surface, retreating quickly when I blinked. Whatever had left the fish was watching us, testing us. That night, the hunger gnawed at me. The rations were thinning, and the smell of that forbidden meal still clung to the galley walls, taunting me. I hated myself for thinking it, but a part of me envied the cook in his final moments, his bliss before the horror. I wondered if the fish had tasted like freedom, if only for a second. The thought nearly drove me mad, and I pressed my hands to my ears, as though it might block the craving. When I finally drifted to sleep, I dreamed of scales glittering in the dark and teeth clicking in unison, waiting for me to bite back. I woke to find a single fish lying at the foot of my bunk. No one admitted to placing it there, and the captain swore the hatch had been locked all night. It was smaller than the others, its eyes almost human in shape, and its gills opened like a mouth whispering secrets I couldn't hear. I wanted to scream, to throw it overboard, but I froze. My hunger begged me to taste it, to prove the others wrong. My sanity clawed for me to resist. I don't know how long I stood there trembling, before Jonas burst in, grabbed the fish, and hurled it out the porthole. He didn't say a word to me. He didn't need to. His silence was enough to remind me that the sea was patient, and I was weak. That day, I kept to myself, avoiding the others. I couldn't trust my own cravings anymore. Couldn't be sure if the sea had found a way inside my mind. Every creak of the hull sounded like a whisper. Every shadow near the waterline felt like an invitation. I knew then that the rules weren't meant to just protect us from what lived below. They were meant to protect us from ourselves. It was Jonas who first muttered Rule 6. Never clean blood off the deck after midnight, though his tone carried less warning and more dread. By then, we had lost Dario, Matteo, and the cook, each gone without a trace or explanation, and the crew walked the halls like sleepwalkers. Midnight had become a dangerous hour, the time when even breathing too loudly felt like an invitation for the trench to notice us. Still, when I woke one night to find crimson streaks glistening along the planks outside my cabin, instinct told me to scrub it away before the captain noticed. That was when Jonas's voice stopped me cold. The blood was fresh, thick, and too much for one man to shed quietly. It trailed from the galley door to the stern, vanishing where the railing met open sea. My stomach twisted as I followed the line, wondering whose bunk I'd find empty next. But when I checked, everyone was accounted for, snoring or trembling in restless sleep. No one was missing, yet the blood remained. My mind raced through possibilities: injury, prank, hallucination, but none fit. Jonas appeared from the shadows, lantern in hand, his face pale as he shook his head. "Don't touch it," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "It isn't ours." That was the first time I understood what he meant. The blood didn't belong to any of us. It had come from something else. I leaned closer despite his warning, drawn by the strange sheen of the liquid. It shimmered faintly, as though tiny lights swam in its depths, shifting colors between red, green, and deep violet. The deck beneath seemed to pulse faintly, as if absorbing the liquid like roots drawing in water. Jonas dragged me back before I could lay a hand on it. "You clean it," he hissed. "You invite what bled it. You'll bring it aboard." His words lodged in me like hooks, but my curiosity clawed harder. When dawn came, the blood was gone. Not washed away, not dried, just gone, leaving the planks spotless, as if it had never existed. The others didn't question it, but I couldn't shake the image of that glowing shimmer sinking into the wood. Later that day, the captain pulled me aside, his eyes weary and hollow. He asked if I'd touched it. When I swore I hadn't, his shoulders slumped in relief. "You wouldn't be here now if you had," he said grimly. I pressed him for more, but he walked away, muttering about debts to the sea we could never repay. A week later, I heard it again, the faint sound of dripping outside my door, rhythmic and patient. Against my better judgment, I opened the hatch. Blood pooled across the deck, far more than before, spreading in slow rivers that didn't flow downward, but seemed to climb against the grain of the boards. I gagged at the metallic stench, but what froze me wasn't the smell. It was the reflection in the liquid. My face stared back at me, but the eyes were black pits, and the mouth smiled even though mine did not. I stumbled back, slamming the door, my pulse hammering in my throat. The next morning, Matteo's bunk was full again. For a moment, I thought I was losing my mind, because there he was, sitting upright, staring blankly at the ceiling. His skin was pale, waxy, and the hollowness where his eyes should have been had returned to sockets that now looked disturbingly normal. "You're not supposed to be here," I whispered, but he didn't respond. He only turned his head slowly toward me, lips parting to reveal gums slick with fresh blood. Before I could cry out, Jonas dragged me away, shaking me hard enough to rattle my teeth. "Don't look at him," he barked. "That's not him anymore." The captain confirmed it later, with a grim nod. Sometimes when the blood comes, it brings pieces of them back, not who they were, just shadows. The idea made my skin crawl. If I had cleaned the deck, would I have invited more than shadows? Would the sea have claimed me too, remade me into something hollow, walking but no longer alive? I stopped asking questions after that. Curiosity was no longer a luxury. It was a knife pressed to my throat. That night, the dripping returned, louder, closer. I buried my head under the blanket, refusing to rise, but sleep wouldn't come. The air felt heavy, thick with iron, and I swore I could feel droplets striking my skin even beneath the covers. When I finally peeked out, my heart nearly stopped. A trail of blood streaked from the door across the floor, ending right at my bunk. The boards were slick and wet, but there was no source, no wound, nothing to explain it. Only my reflection staring up, mouth moving in silence. I pressed my eyes shut until dawn, shaking uncontrollably. When daylight came, the floor was clean. No one else saw what I had, or maybe they refused to admit it. I asked Jonas if the sea was playing tricks, if maybe the blood was just meant to drive us mad. He gave me a hard look. "Madness is mercy compared to what waits if you answer it," he said. His voice cracked on the last word, and for the first time I realized Jonas was afraid not of dying, but of becoming something else entirely. The silence that followed told me enough. The sea didn't just want us dead, it wanted us changed. Days blurred after that, each one heavier than the last. I stopped counting meals, stopped sleeping more than an hour at a time. Each night, I dreaded hearing the drip, the slow spread of crimson that seemed to follow me alone. The crew grew thinner, quieter, their eyes hollowed out with exhaustion and fear. I began to wonder if anyone would make it home, or if we were already ghosts, trapped on a vessel drifting between life and whatever waited in the trench. By then I no longer trusted the wood beneath my feet, or the air I breathed. Every creak, every groan, felt alive. The last time it came, I nearly broke. The blood wasn't streaked across the deck this time. It was pooled at the base of my bed. My boots sat in the middle of it, soaked through, though I hadn't touched them in days. The reflection in the liquid smiled up at me again, but this time, it raised a hand, mimicking my own shaking one. I screamed, throwing the blanket over the floor, refusing to look, praying morning would save me. But as I lay there, trembling and weeping, I felt it. The boards beneath me pulsed faintly, as if something vast and living pressed against the underside of the ship, drinking back what it had spilled. When morning came, the blood was gone, but the boots were missing too. I told no one. Some things, I realized, weren't warnings for the crew, they were for me alone. I first heard them the night after Jonas collapsed, by the stern muttering nonsense until his lips foamed. The others claimed it was exhaustion, but I knew better. He had been too close to the blood, too many times. That night, while the rest of the crew feigned sleep, the sound reached me, thin, beckoning voices drifting through the planks beneath my bunk. Rule 7, never follow whispers into the lower decks. Jonas had spoken those words before his mind cracked, and now they circled in my head as the voices pulled at me like a tide. The whispers weren't like any language I knew. They shifted between words I almost understood and guttural tones that scraped like claws against my skull. Sometimes, they echoed my own thoughts back at me, twisted just enough to make me doubt what was mine and what belonged to the ship. "Come below," they urged, weaving promises of warmth, of answers, of silence from the endless dread. The temptation was unbearable. After weeks of fear, wouldn't it be easier to obey? To find out what called beneath us rather than suffer in ignorance above? One night, unable to resist, I crept from my bunk. The lantern in my hand felt too dim, its glow swallowed by shadows that pressed close on either side of the narrow corridor. The voices grew clearer as I neared the hatch to the lower decks, as if my steps stirred them awake. My heart pounded, but I told myself I wasn't following. I was only listening, curious, cautious. Yet when I set my hand on the hatch, the wood was warm, pulsing faintly, as though blood beat beneath it. I froze, bile rising in my throat. My fingers refused to turn the handle. The next morning, the hatch was barred shut with iron chains that hadn't been there before. I asked the captain who had sealed it, but he looked at me with haunted eyes and shook his head. "It seals itself when it's hungry," he said softly, as if explaining something as ordinary as the weather. I wanted to laugh at the madness of it, but the sound caught in my throat. If the hatch locked itself, it meant something alive lurked beneath, something waiting. I told myself I would never touch it again, though part of me burned with the memory of that pulsing warmth. 2 days later, Mateo vanished. His boots and bunk were empty, though no one had seen him leave. The whispers swelled that night, louder, triumphant, echoing in a rhythm like chanting. I pressed my hands over my ears, but the sound vibrated through my skull. Each voice layered over another, forming a choir of tones too vast for human throats. The temptation returned, sharper this time, tugging me toward the hatch like a hook through flesh. I gripped my lantern and stared at the chains, praying they would hold. When I closed my eyes, I saw Mateo standing in the dark below, smiling. The following morning, the captain announced no one was to speak of Mateo again. "He's gone where he chose," he said, his voice hard but brittle. Yet at dinner, I caught sight of Mateo sitting at the far end of the table, pale, eyes hollow. When I blinked, he was gone again, and the others ate in silence as if nothing had happened. My spoon trembled in my hand. Were the whispers showing me things, or was I unraveling faster than Jonas had? The question lingered long after the lamps were extinguished, gnawing at me more than hunger ever could. That night, I dreamt I was below the hatch. The air was damp and stifling, thick with salt and rot. Shapes shifted in the corners of my vision, too large to belong on a ship, too fluid to belong anywhere on land. A chorus of whispers encircled me, promising I would never be alone again if I let them in. I woke with seawater in my lungs, coughing violently, my sheets soaked as if I'd been dragged through the ocean itself. The crew stared at me with quiet horror, but no one spoke. They all knew better than to ask. By now sleep had become impossible. Each time my eyes closed, the whispers found me, their words burrowing deep, offering impossible truths. They told me where the blood came from, why it shimmered, why it vanished. They said the ship itself was alive, and that it fed not just on the sea but on us. Each plank was marrow, each nail a tooth, each rope a vein, pulsing with salt-water blood. The more I listened, the more sense it made. The vessel wasn't carrying us across the trench. It was part of the trench, an appendage of something older than the world. The chains on the hatch rattled that evening, loud enough for the whole crew to hear. Some covered their ears. Others wept. I sat frozen, my body torn between terror and the urge to descend. The voices promised me peace, an end to the gnawing fear, the hunger, the exhaustion. They swore the lower decks were not a prison but a sanctuary, where no man suffered alone. My lantern flickered, and for a heartbeat, I swore I saw hands reaching up from the cracks between the boards, black fingers curling to drag me down. Jonas died the next morning, his body discovered slumped against the sealed hatch. His nails were broken, bloodied, as if he'd tried to claw his way through the chains. No one touched him, no one dared move the body. By nightfall he was gone, without a sound, leaving only deep gouges etched into the wood where he had torn at it. The whispers that followed were different, stronger, more confident, as though claiming victory. I pressed myself against my bunk, praying for silence, but the voices only grew sweeter, coaxing, promising. Now when I walk the corridors, the shadows bend closer, their outlines almost human. I see familiar faces in the dark, crewmen who should be alive yet walk alongside me with eyes too bright, too empty. They whisper with the same voices that call from below, and sometimes I cannot tell whether it is the ship speaking or my own thoughts turned against me. I'm no longer certain what lies behind the chains, but I know this much. The longer I resist, the louder the voices become, and if I ever set foot below, I will not return as myself. Every night, the hatch pulses like a beating heart, louder, faster, calling for me. And every night, I sit awake, clutching my lantern, repeating Jonas's warning until my throat is raw. The words are the only barrier I have left, between sanity and surrender, a frail shield against a hunger I cannot see. I don't know how much longer I can resist. It happened 3 nights after Jonas vanished. We had been rationing stale bread and salted meat for weeks, and the hunger chewed at us like rats in the belly. That was when the nets came back heavy with something none of us had ever seen before. The fish shimmered, their scales glowing faintly, casting a ghostly light that turned our hands blue as we hauled them in. Rule 8. Never eat fish that glows in the dark. The words were carved into the captain's logbook, underlined twice, but by then half the crew was already licking their lips. At first glance, the fish looked harmless enough. Their bodies were long and sleek, with eyes that seemed too human, almost watchful as they writhed in the nets. Mateo whispered that they must be blessed, a gift from the sea to keep us alive. But I noticed something off. The glow wasn't steady. It pulsed faintly, in time with the rhythm of the waves, as though the fish were breathing with the ocean itself. I backed away, clutching the lantern tighter, but hunger was stronger than fear for most of the men. They piled the catch on the deck, their laughter sharp and desperate. The captain ordered the fish thrown back immediately, his voice hoarse with anger, but the crew turned restless. "We'll starve before the trench lets us out," one growled. "Better to eat and risk than waste food." The mutiny hung in the air like smoke, unspoken but ready to ignite. I caught the captain's eyes, saw the panic there, and realized he had lost their loyalty the moment the glowing fish touched the deck. Hunger changes men faster than madness, and the trench was feeding both. I wanted to scream at them, to remind them of the rules, but my throat closed. That night, against the captain's orders, a few men built a small fire on the upper deck. They gutted the glowing fish, and I watched in horror as its blood spread across the boards like spilled ink, seeping into the cracks. The smell was unlike anything I'd known, sweet and cloying, yet tinged with rot, a scent that made my teeth ache. They roasted the flesh, which hissed and sparked, and when they bit into it, their mouths lit faintly from the inside, like lanterns flickering through their throats. Some laughed, delighted, their voices strangely doubled, echoing in a pitch lower than their own. By morning, the men who had eaten the fish were different. Their skin had taken on a faint luminescence, glowing faintly in the dark corners of the ship. Their eyes, once dull with exhaustion, now shone too brightly, like glass catching moonlight. They moved differently, too smooth, too coordinated, their steps in sync as if guided by something unseen. When they spoke, their voices carried a resonance that made the hairs on my arms rise. They grinned at me with teeth that looked sharper than they had the day before, and I realized too late that hunger hadn't been sated, it had been reborn. The captain locked himself in his quarters, refusing to face what had happened. The rest of us avoided the glowing men as best we could, though they roamed the deck at night, whispering to each other in a language none of us knew. Sometimes they stood at the edge of the ship, staring into the trench, swaying in time with the waves. Once I caught Mateo leaning dangerously close to them, his eyes glazed as though in a trance. I grabbed his arm, yanking him back, but he shoved me away with strength that startled me. "They're blessed," he hissed. "Can't you see?" Soon the glowing men stopped eating anything else. They ignored bread, meat, even fresh water. Instead, they gathered on deck, whenever the nets pulled more of the shimmering fish from the depths, devouring them raw, their mouths glowing brighter with each bite. Their hunger was endless, their laughter jagged, filled with a kind of joy I couldn't understand. At night, I heard them beneath the deck, scuttling on all fours like beasts, their glow leaking through the cracks in the wood. The ship groaned louder each time, as though in pain, and I wondered if it was feeding them, or if they were feeding it. One evening, I woke to find one of them standing over me, his glowing eyes inches from my face. His smile was too wide, stretching unnaturally, his breath cold and briny. He whispered something in that strange doubled voice, but I couldn't understand the words. My body locked with terror, unable to move, until he finally stepped back and slithered away into the darkness. The captain confronted them the next morning, pistol in hand, demanding they stop, but they only laughed, their laughter harmonizing until it sounded like a hymn. and within moments the captain's pistol slipped from his grasp. His eyes glazed, his body swaying. We lost the captain that night. He didn't vanish like Mateo or Jonas. He joined them. I saw him by the railing, glowing faintly now, his voice blending seamlessly into theirs. The last trace of authority on the ship had dissolved into the same hunger that had already consumed too many of us. I realized then that the rules weren't just to protect us from the sea, they were to protect us from ourselves. Breaking them didn't kill you instantly. It turned you slowly, reshaped you, until you weren't yourself anymore, until you belonged to the trench. By then food supplies were nearly gone, and the temptation of the glowing fish grew unbearable for those of us still untouched. I saw men pacing the deck, staring at the nets, their lips trembling with desire. Even I felt it, the thought of warmth spreading through my starved body, the promise of strength and strange light filling my veins. But every time the hunger clawed at me, I forced myself to remember the words etched in the logbook, the captain's desperate warning, Jonas's broken mind. I whispered the rule under my breath, like a prayer, clinging to it as my last anchor to sanity. The glowing men no longer hid their true faces, their skin peeled in places, revealing slick, scaled flesh beneath. Their eyes widened unnaturally, their limbs stretching, bending wrong. They no longer slept, no longer rested, only prowled the ship, watching us with predatory patience. Sometimes, they slipped into the sea without a splash, vanishing for hours, only to return with their mouths stained dark, their glow brighter. I stopped wondering what they were eating down there. I already knew. Now I wake each night to the sound of them humming, a deep, resonant sound that vibrates through the hull, through my bones, pulling at my dreams. When I close my eyes, I see the glowing fish swarming in the depths, their eyes fixed on me, waiting. I know hunger will come for me too, sooner or later, and when it does, I pray I have the strength to remember the rule, because the moment I take a single bite, I won't just be lost, I'll be one of them. The first time the bells rang, I thought it was the wind knocking the clapper loose. But when the sound echoed through the ship, every man froze where he stood. The captain had once warned us about it before he changed, though most of us dismissed it as another superstition. Rule 9, never stay alone on deck after the bells rang 3 times. I remembered the way his voice shook when he said it, the fear etched deep in his eyes, and I knew then that this was no accident of wind or rust. Something else was calling us to attention. The bells rang at midnight, though no one had touched them. Their tone was too steady, too deliberate, each strike carrying across the waves as though the sea itself was amplifying the sound. I gripped the railing, searching for any movement near the mast, but the deck was empty, except for the glow of those who had already given in to the fish. They tilted their heads toward the sound, smiling faintly, swaying in rhythm with the tolls. My stomach twisted at the sight, realizing they were not disturbed, but pleased, as if the bells were a hymn meant for them alone. When the third toll faded into silence, I felt a weight settle over the ship, like unseen eyes had turned toward us. A few of the crew muttered prayers, their voices cracking. One man, Ortiz, scoffed at the fear and insisted he'd stand guard on deck to prove it was nothing but bad rigging. We tried to stop him, pleaded with him to wait until dawn, but his pride was louder than our terror. He leaned his rifle against his shoulder, sneering at our warnings, and paced the deck like a man marching to his own grave. From below I watched through a porthole as Ortiz vanished into the fog. At first, nothing happened. The sea lay still, the deck quiet, then shadows began to gather around him, forming shapes that bent wrong against the lantern light. He didn't notice at first, too busy cursing us for cowards, but I saw his words falter as his head turned sharply, following something none of us could see. He raised his rifle, aiming at empty air, then lowered it slowly, his face slackening into something like awe. By the time I blinked, he was gone. The next morning, the rifle was found propped neatly against the mast, polished clean, though no one had touched it. There was no blood, No torn cloth, no sign of struggle, just the faint echo of bells carried on the wind, long after they should have ceased. The crew grew restless, arguing in hushed tones about whether Ortiz had been taken by the sea, by the glowing men, or by something else entirely. I kept my mouth shut, though I knew in my gut it was none of those things. The bells weren't a warning, they were an invitation, and Ortiz had answered it. The following night, the bells rang again, 3 strikes, slow and deliberate. I huddled with the others below deck, but one of the newer men, blinded by hunger and fear, whispered that maybe Ortiz was still alive, maybe the bells were guiding us to him. His words spread like sickness through the dark, tempting the weak-willed. By the second toll, he had climbed the ladder, ignoring our desperate pleas. I saw the glow of his lantern vanish into the mist, just as the 3rd strike sounded. His scream came minutes later, sharp and raw, cut short so quickly it barely sounded human. After that, we began barricading the hatch at night, forcing ourselves to stay below deck until dawn. But the whispers grew louder with each toll, pressing at the walls, seeping through the planks like mist. Sometimes, I swore I heard Ortiz's voice among them, calling my name, begging me to come outside. The urge to open the hatch became unbearable, my hands trembling with the effort of holding the lock in place. I realized then that the bells were not just meant to lure us out, they were meant to divide us, to thin the herd until only the willing remained. One evening, I woke to find Mateo standing by the hatch, his body glowing faintly, his hand resting on the lock. His lips moved soundlessly, mouthing words I couldn't hear, but his eyes never left mine. I tried to call out, but no sound left my throat. In the next blink, he was gone, leaving the lock unfastened. My chest tightened with dread as I slid the bolt back into place, my hands slick with sweat. I never told the others. I didn't have to. They all knew the glowing ones wanted us alone, waiting for the bells. By the 5th night, no one slept. The bells rang like clockwork, 3 tolls at midnight, shaking us awake no matter how tightly we covered our ears. The strain broke us down, turned us against each other. Some whispered that we should sacrifice one man each night, leave him on deck to appease whatever called the bells. Others argued that we should destroy the mast entirely, though the thought of touching it made everyone recoil. I sat in silence, my mind replaying Ortiz's final moments over and over, wondering if he had been devoured, or if he had simply stepped into a place we couldn't follow. The glowing men no longer avoided the tolls. They stood proudly at the railing each night, their bodies swaying, their mouths moving in unison with the sound. Their glow brightened with every strike, and I realized the bells were feeding them, drawing energy from somewhere we couldn't see. They weren't afraid of the sound because it wasn't meant for us. It was meant for them, to grow them, to strengthen them. And if we stayed too close, if we listened too long, it would change us too. Tonight, the bells have rung again, louder than ever. I can feel the sound rattling my bones, tugging at the edges of my mind. The others are huddled together, praying, but I can see the cracks forming in their resolve. The hatch creaks with every toll, as though it wants to burst open and drag us out. My lantern flickers, shadows stretching too far across the walls, shapes bending where no shapes should be. I know one thing for certain: the moment I am left alone on that deck, after the 3rd toll, I will not be myself when the dawn comes. The first time I saw it happen, I thought my eyes were playing tricks on me. The sea had been calm for days, the fog thick but still, and then without warning, the moon bled across the sky, casting the water in a crimson sheen. The glow painted our faces, staining everything in its path. That was when I remembered the captain's warning etched into the logbook. Rule 10. Never look directly at the horizon when the moon turns red, but hunger, fear, and exhaustion dull the mind. And one of the men couldn't resist staring straight into it. His name was Calloway, a man who once laughed the loudest, cursed the hardest, and sang shanties when the night grew too heavy. But under that bleeding sky, his laughter curdled. He stood by the railing, his eyes wide and unblinking, the red light reflecting off his pupils like coals. At first he whispered about beauty, about how the horizon seemed to stretch wider, deeper, like an endless road leading somewhere beyond the trench. Then his voice cracked, his words shifting into something guttural, a language none of us recognized. By the time we dragged him below deck, his lips were moving soundlessly, as if speaking to someone only he could see. We tried to shake him, to break the spell, but Calloway's gaze never left that invisible horizon. His body convulsed as if the sea itself was flowing through him. He screamed once, sharp and ragged, before falling silent, his chest rising and falling in a slow rhythm that didn't match any heartbeat I had ever known. His glow began soon after, not the faint, hungry shimmer of the fish-eaters, but something deeper, redder, as though the blood moon had carved itself into his flesh. We bound him with ropes, but the knots strained against an unseen force pulling him toward the deck above. The next night, the moon bled again, and this time more men faltered. I heard gasps from the bunks as cracks appeared in their resolve. The pull of the horizon was stronger than hunger, stronger than the bells, stronger than fear. Men clawed at the walls, desperate for a glimpse, even when we covered every porthole with canvas. One of them bit through his own tongue as he screamed for release, his blood spraying across the boards in a crimson arc that seemed to shimmer under the light. I pressed my hands over my ears, whispering the rule to myself, terrified that even remembering the horizon would draw it closer. By the third night, Calloway was gone. His ropes lay shredded, though no blade had touched them. We found his boots by the railing, glowing faintly red, the leather charred as if burned from within. No splash had marked his departure, no ripple across the water. It was as though the horizon had simply claimed him, pulling him across that crimson bridge to a place we could not follow. The glowing men smiled when they saw the boots, their teeth sharp in the red light, as though they had been waiting for this moment. The blood moon became a rhythm, its cycles tightening until we feared its return more than hunger. Some nights it would linger for hours, stretching the ship in strange ways. The deck tilted, the planks groaning, and when I dared to glance sideways, I swore the horizon curved upward, forming a wall of crimson water holding us in place. Shapes moved within it, vast coiling silhouettes that dwarfed the ship, their outlines shimmering with every pulse of the moon. I closed my eyes, but the after image of their movement burned behind my eyelids, writhing, calling, promising release. One evening, Mateo nearly broke. His hand trembled as he reached for the hatch, his lips quivering with words he could not speak. I grabbed him, forcing his gaze away from the faint glow leaking through the cracks, but his body convulsed like Calloway's had, his eyes rolling back. "It's beautiful," he whispered through clenched teeth, his voice not entirely his own. "It wants us." I bound him to the bunk, though my hands shook the entire time. When he woke hours later, he wept silently, his glow faint but growing. I knew then he wouldn't last long. By now no one dared to speak of the blood moon aloud. We tried to act as if ignoring it could keep it away, but the glow still seeped into our dreams. In mine I walked across a crimson sea, the horizon endless, my body light as air. Shadows loomed on either side, whispering promises of freedom, of peace, if only I stopped resisting. I always woke with salt on my tongue and blood in my mouth, my chest heaving as if I had been screaming underwater. Each time I swore I could feel Calloway walking just ahead of me, leading the way. The glowing men grew stronger with each blood moon. Their light shifted from pale blue to deep red, and they no longer bothered hiding what they were becoming. Their skin peeled in sheets, revealing sinew that pulsed faintly with light. Their voices deepened, their laughter rising into harmonies that shook the hull. When the moon rose, they gathered at the railing, gazing openly at the horizon, their bodies trembling with pleasure. I turned away, but the sound of their joy made me sick, and I feared the day I could no longer resist joining them. Now every time the moon turns red, I lock myself in the darkest corner of the hold, covering my eyes with my hands, repeating the rule over and over until my voice breaks. Still, the glow seeps through my fingers, painting the world in crimson even when I refuse to look. I know my strength won't hold forever. One night, the pull will be too strong, and I will glance, even for a heartbeat. And when I do, the horizon will claim me, just as it claimed Calloway. The bells have stopped ringing now, and the whispers have grown quiet, as if all else waits for the blood moon. Tonight, the glow seeps through the cracks already, brighter than ever before. My lantern sputters, the shadows writhing against the boards. The crew huddles together, their bodies trembling, but I can hear them whispering, their voices rising in unison. It's beautiful. My heart pounds as the light grows stronger, burning against my eyelids. I don't know how much longer I can resist. The horizon is waiting for me, and I fear the next time I open my eyes I won't be able to look away. I had always believed the ocean spoke in many tongues. The crash of the waves, the groan of the hull, the hiss of wind rushing through cables. But after Calloway vanished beneath the blood moon, I learned the sea had another voice. It was not the sound of tide or storm. It was intimate, low and deliberate, a whisper meant for me alone. The captain's logbook had warned of it in a final trembling scrawl. Rule 11. Never answer the voice that calls your name from the water. I thought it superstition, another sailor's tale etched in desperation. But that was before the sea called to me in my mother's voice. The first night it came, I was awake in my bunk, clutching a lantern like a child clings to a toy for safety. The others slept in uneasy heaps, their faces turned toward the floor to avoid the crimson glow leaking through the seams. Then I heard it, faint at first, as if carried by the wind. Daniel. My name, soft and gentle, the way she used to call me in for supper when I lingered too long outside. My heart twisted. My mother had been dead for 7 years, yet the voice was perfect, too perfect. I buried my face in my hands, whispering the rule, but the sound seeped in through the cracks, coiling in my ears. The next night, it was my brother's voice. He had drowned when I was 12, swept away by a current too strong for either of us to fight. I had lived with the guilt ever since, but hearing him call from the water shattered something inside me. "Help me, Danny," he cried, as though he were still clinging to the rope I failed to hold. My hands shook as I pressed them over my ears, but the voice slipped through like water through cloth. I bit down hard on my tongue, the taste of blood sharp and real, reminding me not to answer. Still, I nearly broke. Nearly. By the third night, it was not just my family. The water learned the crew's voices too, mimicking them with flawless cruelty. I heard Mateo begging for help, even while I knew he was tied down beside me. I heard Calloway laughing, his chuckle bubbling with the sound of drowning, though he was long gone. I even heard the captain, his voice gruff and commanding. "Open the hatch. The ship is lost." The men stirred in their bunks, whimpering as the voices multiplied, overlapping into a chorus of the damned. It was only then I realized, the water wasn't just calling, it was hunting. The glowing men answered first. Drawn by the voices, they rose in unison, eyes blazing crimson. They moved with a purpose beyond hunger or instinct, climbing the ladders to the deck as though summoned. I followed, keeping to the shadows, praying they would ignore me. Through a crack in the boards, I watched as they leaned over the railing, their mouths opening wide. The voices called their names, one by one, coaxing them closer, and then, with no hesitation, they slipped silently into the water, their glow vanishing beneath the waves. The horizon pulsed once, as though satisfied, and the sea fell silent. After that night, fewer of us remained. Those who still resisted whispered their confessions in the dark, afraid their own loved ones would be next to call. One man wept for the child he left behind, certain he would hear her voice before long. Another swore he already heard his wife, singing lullabies through the water. We all knew the voices would never stop. They would dig deeper, pull harder, until one by one, we slipped and answered. The logbook's rule was no superstition. It was survival. Then came the night it called me again, louder than ever before. This time it wasn't my mother, my brother, or anyone I had lost. It was me, my own voice echoing back from the waves, calm and certain. "Daniel," it said, "you don't have to be afraid anymore. We're waiting, all of us. Just answer." The sound rattled through the hull, vibrating in my bones. I clamped my hands over my mouth to keep from crying out, but my own voice spoke again, closer this time, almost inside my skull. My heart hammered as I realized the truth. It didn't need to trick me anymore. It knew me better than I knew myself. I staggered to the galley, desperate for light, for noise, for anything to drown it out. The lanterns sputtered, their flames weak, but I clutched them anyway, whispering every prayer I remembered. Still the voice pressed harder, warm and inviting, promising relief from hunger, from fear, from the endless rules. I sank to my knees, tears streaming, my throat aching with the effort of silence. It wasn't just a call anymore, it was a command, and I was running out of strength to disobey. When dawn came, or what passed for dawn, in that endless twilight, I realized I wasn't the only one fighting. Mateo sat across from me, his face pale, his lips chewed raw. He had heard his wife calling him all night, he said, her voice sweet and clear as a lullaby. He admitted he had spoken once, a single word, yes, before biting his tongue until it bled. His glow was brighter now, pulsing faintly beneath his skin. He knew he was doomed. I held his hand anyway, though we both trembled, knowing the water had already marked him. Now every creak of the hull sounds like my name. Every drip of condensation on the boards whispers in a familiar cadence. I have stopped sleeping, terrified that exhaustion will loosen my tongue. The others avoid me, their eyes hollow, their voices ragged, as though they no longer trust themselves not to answer. I wonder how many rules remain, and how many of us will live to hear them. The logbook grows thinner, each page darker, smeared with salt and blood, but the final words linger, etched deeper than the rest. The sea calls us all sooner or later. Tonight the water is louder than ever. It speaks in a dozen voices, my family, my crew, my own. I sit in the dark, lantern in hand, lips pressed tight, praying I can resist, but the glow outside the porthole grows brighter, and I swear I can see faces forming in the waves, smiling, beckoning, their mouths open in unison, and my own voice rises above them all, clear and undeniable. "Daniel, answer me."